Lawler, welcome to the subcommittee. The Immigration Subcommittee meets today to hear testimony on the effect of the ongoing border crisis that began on Inauguration Day of 2021. We have four witnesses with us today who are going to testify to the effects that this is having on the social services of our cities, as well as the tragedies that it is causing for our citizens. With that, we will begin with our first witness is Chief Rodney Scott, formerly the Chief of the Border Patrol of the United States. Mr. Scott, we welcome you to the hearing today and recognize you. Oh, I'm sorry, we're going to start with, see, that's what happens when I go scriptless. I will actually begin with opening statements, and I'll begin with myself. When President Biden canceled construction of the border wall and ordered ICE not to enforce court-ordered deportations, we have seen 2.1 million illegal immigrants unlawfully admitted to the United States by this administration. That is a population larger than the entire state of Nebraska. And while that's been going on, an additional 1.5 million known gotaways have entered while the Border Patrol has been overwhelmed. That's an additional illegal population larger than the state of Hawaii. Combined, that's 3.6 million illegal migrants admitted to our country. That's larger than the population of 20 of our states, and that's just in 28 months. The danger of this policy should be self-evident. When the president surrendered unconditionally to the Taliban and abandoned Bagram Air Base in the middle of the night, he released 5,000 of the most dangerous terrorists on the planet who were detained there. We know where one went. 10 days later, he went to Abbey Gate at Kabul airport and detonated the bomb that killed 13 U.S. Marines. We know that nearly 200 individuals on the terrorist watch list were apprehended by the Border Patrol in 2022 and 2023, compared to just 14 in all 4 years of the Trump administration combined. What we don't know is how many more are among the 1.5 million known gotaways. Now, HHS Secretary Javier Becerra told his staff that he demanded a rapid release of illegal migrants into the country. He compared it to an assembly line, and he warned subordinates that if they didn't move faster, he'd find others who would. The lack of any serious vetting of those entering our country is producing tragic results for families like that of Kayla Hamilton, whose grieving mother we will hear from today. In her case, a 17-year-old MS-13 gang member was released into the United States as an unaccompanied alien child. Kayla Hamilton is dead as a result. Police investigating her murder noticed her assailant had gang tattoos, and one call to El Salvadorian authorities confirmed he was a known MS-13 gang member, something federal officials never bothered to ask, as they recklessly allowed him to enter the United States. Drug trafficking now produces an average of 200 fentanyl deaths in the United States every day, the equivalent of a passenger jet crashing every day. Just a few days of such carnage would ground every aircraft in America. But we're told that human trafficking is now becoming an even more profitable business to the cartels than drugs. Illegal migrants arrive deeply in debt to the cartels, whose violent gangs are proliferating in our cities to enforce these debts. In places like Tulare County, California, just outside of my district, we're starting to see cartel executions of entire families, including, in this case, a mom shot through the head as she shielded her baby. Every Border Patrol officer says the same thing. This is no longer a border problem. If it hasn't already come to your community, it soon will. I'm afraid this will culminate either in a terrorist attack by elements that have come in through our border or the kind of cartel gun battles breaking out in cities that have already become commonplace in Mexico. Now, this is not to paint every illegal migrant as a gang member or terrorist, But the Biden open borders policy is clearly allowing many dangerous gang members, terrorists, and criminals into our country, and he doesn't seem to care about the resulting damage. Meanwhile, the social safety net meant to help Americans in need is collapsing under the weight of millions of desperate, destitute, and dependent illegal migrants who are flooding our country. New York City has now turned as many as 20 public school gymnasiums into hotels for illegal aliens. Recess is canceled because single adult men are sleeping on cots in gyms intended for school children. We've heard from food pantries whose supplies are exhausted because of the explosion of illegal migrants. We've heard from hospital administrators at the border who've had to tell American citizens that they have no room for them because they're overwhelmed by migrants. And we hear from law enforcement of the increasing presence of criminal cartels and foreign gangs in their communities. Yet the Democrats' witness is going to tell us a solution: simply spend more money and process illegal migrants faster. This is lunacy. It is a crime to illegally enter the United States. Federal law requires every asylum claimant to be detained until their case is heard and to be deported if it's rejected. But this administration simply ignores the law. Now, these first hearings have examined the effect of these policies. Over the next few weeks, we will turn our attention to the cause, what laws are being violated and by whom. And with that, I'm pleased to recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. Jayapal, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start just by taking a moment to express my deepest condolences to you, Ms. Nobles. You have experienced a profound loss, and I appreciate your coming to share Kayla's story with us today. Turning to today's hearing, it appears once again, unfortunately, that it's Groundhog Day in our subcommittee. Today is part 3 of our hearings on the Republicans' assault on immigrants and immigration, and I'm sure we'll have many more parts to come. I worry that today will be more of the same, with my Republican colleagues once again showing us that they are not serious about governing and finding solutions to the complex issue of immigration. After passing their extreme, cruel, and unworkable border bill, where the only bipartisan thing about it was the opposition, Republicans have spent the last few weeks fear-mongering over the end of Title 42. This fear-mongering about the border, let me be clear, empowers the smugglers and cartels when our Republican colleagues claim that the border is open. That is the most important information that they use to continue their activities. Turns into disinformation and misinformation shared by smugglers, distributed by social media, and stoked by relentless right-wing media lies and shouts of open borders, all of which fuel migration patterns. And yet, what are the facts? The facts are that when Title 42, a public health policy, not an immigration enforcement policy, finally ended, what happened? Border encounters plummeted by 70%. Thus far, the increased migration narrative pushed in the right-wing media has not yet come. The lower numbers are likely due, at least in part, to the Biden administration's new policies announced in the lead-up to the end of Title 42. These announcements detailed how they plan to address migration to the southwest border going forward. The administration showed that once again, Democrats have real, workable solutions to manage migration and expand legal pathways. On top of the parole programs created by the Biden administration earlier this year, the administration announced the creation of additional legal pathways that are intended to relieve pressure at the border. The administration announced that they're opening regional processing centers across the Western Hemisphere for the first time to facilitate access to legal pathways in the United States. This is an important step to allow migrants to get their protection and benefits claims assessed in a humane way without having to make the dangerous journey to the U.S.-Mexico border. The administration is also creating new family reunification parole processes for El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Colombia. This is for people who already have an approved family petition modeled off of the Cuban family reunification program my colleagues attempted to codify in H.R. 2. The administration is also increasing the number of appointments that will be available under the CBP One app, which, while far from perfect, does increase CBP's ability to process more migrants. The administration also implemented new policies that I do have significant concerns about. This includes a new asylum regulation that limits access to asylum for those who cross between ports of entry, as well as new expedited processing of single adults from Spanish-speaking countries, where individuals will get an initial asylum screening in a Border Patrol facility. Now, none of these solutions are perfect. Addressing the issue of migration is difficult, but Democrats have shown time and time again that we take this complex humanitarian crisis seriously. By creating a more humane immigration system that recognizes the horrific conditions that cause migrants to flee, as well as contributions of immigrants to America, we can decrease unauthorized crossings, strengthen our economy, and protect migrants and citizens from harm. Unfortunately, Republicans have showed us their priorities with their border bill and now with their fiscal year 2024 Department of Homeland Security appropriations bill. That bill would only create more disorder at the border. Budgets are moral documents that show what we value and prioritize. Their bill, which was released last week, defunds the Emergency Food and Shelter Program, which is helping migrants who are processed by CBP move away from the border to be with sponsors or family in the United States as they await their court hearing. Their bill ends the use of Family Case Management Program, which had a nearly 100% success rate in helping families show up for their immigration court hearings. And it disallows the use of alternatives to detention unless the Secretary himself directly approves it, which would create a significant bottleneck for moving people out of CBP custody. It defunds the asylum officer rule, which allows asylum officers to adjudicate asylum claims, helps alleviate the growing immigration court backlog, and it ends the use of the CBP One app for people who are coming in through parole, which will severely hamper CBP's ability to process migrants in a safe and orderly way. Now, all of these policy choices give the game away. None of these policy choices are intended to help the agency. They will create more chaos and disorder at the border. But that appears to be the point of my Republican colleagues' efforts. Create chaos and disorder and hope to win the next election. Now, if the chairman of the subcommittee is so concerned about airplanes being grounded, I would just say that the Default on America Act and the attempts that Republicans are making right now to put forward serious cuts, that default would actually halt all of the air traffic controllers across the country. I look forward to hearing from all of our witnesses today. The American people deserve better, and I hope that our witnesses can shed light on real solutions to address the situation at our border in a holistic way. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, Mr. Jordan.
I thank the chairman. The ranking member started her statement by saying the border is secure. Really? More than 5.5 million illegal aliens along the southwest border have been encountered since Joe Biden took office. 2 million of these illegal aliens have been released into American communities, and more than 1.5 million known illegal gotaways have successfully crossed the southwest border undetected. These include criminal gang members, drug dealers, and individuals on the terrorist watch list. That is not a secure border. That is not a closed border.
I never said that. I never started my statement with a secure border. Mr.
That
Chairman,
has happened because on day one,
I'm correcting the record because you stated something that was not true. Thank you, Mr.
The gentlelady should know that interrupting a member without making a valid point of order is against the rules of the committee.
Lie about what I said.
The time belongs to the chairman. Chairman's recognized.
I would just point out the gentlelady said Republicans say the border is open. She said that's not so. Is that so? What does that mean? If it's not open, is it something that's not secure, not closed? I would just saying what she referenced in her opening statement. Day one of this administration, they stopped construction of the wall, they ended Remain in Mexico, and they put back in place catch and release. Day one. That is why we have the situation we do. In that same time period I just talked about, 28 months of this administration, over 43,000 pounds of fentanyl have been seized at the southwest border, with an unknown amount making it into our communities. And there's also been an uptick in the number of individuals on the FBI terrorist watch list. Just 2 weeks ago, Border Patrol apprehended an Afghan who illegally crossed into San Diego sector in California, and days later, news reports indicate that an additional 5 watch-listed illegal aliens were apprehended in Tucson, Arizona, after attempting to avoid detection. Our witnesses today understand the consequences of our borders being unprotected all too well, all of them, and I want to thank them for being here today. I want to particularly thank Ms. Nobles for bravely agreeing to appear here today to talk about the unthinkable tragedy that affected her family. Her daughter, Kayla, was 20 years old when she was assaulted and murdered. The person charged with the crime was an MS-13 gang member who was allowed to enter the United States after crossing the border illegally as a so-called unaccompanied alien child. Despite the USC having a criminal history in El Salvador for MS-13 gang affiliation well before he even entered the United States, law enforcement only became aware of this fact after Kayla's murder. Why not until after Kayla's murder? Because prior to the murder, no one in this administration bothered to check into the UAC's criminal history in his home country. And the Hamilton family was not alone this year in experiencing such a horrific event. In January, suspected cartel members massacred 6 people, including a 10-month-old infant, assassination style in Goshen, California. In April of this year, a nationwide manhunt ensued after a man who had been deported on 4 separate occasions killed 5 people, including a 9-year-old boy. It's well past time that we enforce the law, secure our border, and we should pass, the Senate should pass, the bill that we passed in the House just a few weeks ago so we can get our border under control and secure. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee, Mr. Nadler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I first wish to express my most sincere condolences to Ms. Nobles. I'm so sorry for your loss, and I thank you for coming to tell us Kayla's story. May her memory be a blessing. Mr. Chairman, the United States has a long history of welcoming asylum seekers to our shores. My constituents in Manhattan are able to see a reminder of this history every day in the Statue of Liberty, welcoming the tired, the poor, and huddled masses yearning to breathe free. Throughout our history, refugees from near and far have sought safety here. And while our laws have never been perfect, they have always allowed at least some refugees to enter. Our modern refugee program and the world's view about our collective responsibility for refugees were radically reshaped by the Holocaust. When the United States joined both Canada and Cuba in turning away the MS St. Louis and her more than 900 Jewish passengers in 1939, we allowed asylum seekers to be returned to persecution in Europe. Nearly 1/3 of the boat's passengers perished at the hands of the Nazis. Many other countries also turned away Jewish refugees during World War II. The horrors that followed led to the creation of the United Nations and ultimately to the international refugee framework that we still use today. It took a while for domestic laws to catch up to our international commitments, so when Congress moved too slowly, presidents used their expansive immigration powers to help get people to safety. In 1956, President Eisenhower oversaw the parole of over 30,000 Hungarian refugees into the United States. More parolees followed, including more than 58,000 Cubans between 1961 and 1962, 15,000 Chinese refugees from Hong Kong between 1962 and 1966, and over 130,000 Southeast Asian refugees following the fall of Saigon in 1975. We passed the Refugee Act of 1980 with overwhelming bipartisan support, which established the domestic framework for refugee and asylee processing. The commitment by presidents and lawmakers of both parties to accept refugees solidified our country's status as a symbol of hope for those trying to escape persecution. Sadly, that came to a crashing halt under the Trump administration. Former President Trump slashed our refugee program both at home and abroad, implemented discriminatory bans, demonized immigrants, separated families, and put all of his focus into building a wall between ourselves and Mexico. But still people came, because the dangers they faced on their journeys here paled in comparison to the horrors from which they were fleeing. COVID exacerbated the problems, and President Trump used authorities under Title 42, a policy to protect public health, to turn away asylum seekers arriving at the border. When President Biden came into office, he reversed course on many of the prior administration's most heinous policies. But Title 42 remained, even while our Republican colleagues claimed that the border was open and that President Biden and Secretary Mayorkas were purposefully inviting an invasion, in quotes, of migrants to our shores. These claims were used by smugglers to entice migrants to make the journey north and echoed by mass shooters in their manifestos. The Biden administration has been working to get our immigration system back on track, but Republicans have been fighting him every step of the way. They voted to end the COVID emergency declaration, but they said that the administration should not end its use of Title 42, even though that policy was tied to the pandemic. They passed a messaging bill over bipartisan opposition that would decimate our asylum system and send vulnerable people back into harm's way. In the weeks leading up to Title 42's expiration, they stoked fears that we would see chaos and massive numbers of migrants crossing at the border. And yet, what happened? Thanks to the policies put in place by the Biden administration, the numbers at the border dropped by 70% following the expiration of Title 42. But the fear-mongering continues. Unfortunately, my colleagues are not ones to let facts get in the way of a good story. The latest example comes from my home state of New York, where Orange County Republicans claimed that homeless veterans were being displaced by migrants. This was quickly echoed by the Speaker of the House and other congressional Republicans, and even by one of our witnesses. On the screen are tweet after tweet by my Republican colleagues amplifying the story to stoke fears about the border and to distract from their own failures to enact meaningful solutions. Yet the claims contained in the story have turned out to be completely unfounded, with even the New York Post running a retraction. So here we are again, in another hearing about the, quote, Biden border crisis, close quote. I am sure that no matter what happens at the border, we will continue to have hearings on this topic. And we will continue to see partisan messaging bills that have no chance of ever becoming law. As one of my Republican colleagues said, there's a reason why we haven't gotten significant border security done and why we haven't seen significant immigration reform done. It is in the interests of many politicians to have this crisis continue to flare up. Democrats are willing to work with serious Republicans to make changes to our immigration system that would allow people to come here lawfully while ensuring the safety and security of our citizens. We want to have the tough conversations about the best path forward. And we have passed bipartisan legislation that has addressed some of the thorniest issues, like the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. But so long as this majority insists on its partisan blame games, we are just going to keep talking past each other, and nothing will be solved. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today. Thank you for coming to speak about your experience and your expertise, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. I'll now introduce the four witnesses we have today. The first will be the Honorable Rodney Scott. Chief Scott served over 29 years in the United States Border Patrol before retiring as Chief of the Border Patrol in August of 2021. During that time, he held numerous leadership positions at various stations and sectors along the southwest border, as well as several leadership and specialized assignments at U.S. Customs and Border Protection headquarters. Our second witness will be Mr. Mark Hetfield. Mr. Hetfield has been the president and CEO of the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society since 2013. Prior to that, he held several other positions at the society, worked as an immigration attorney, and worked for the Immigration and Naturalization Service. The Hebrew Immigration Aid Society is a non-governmental organization that settles refugees and provides legal services to aliens. I will now yield to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Lawler, to introduce the third witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Orangetown Supervisor Teresa Kenny, a lifelong Rockland County resident who cares deeply for her residents and their quality of life. Supervisor Kenny is an attorney and daughter of a retired New York City police officer. She has both a deep appreciation for the rule of law and a deep knowledge of our legal system. Prior to serving as supervisor, she served as deputy town attorney for the town of Orangetown, and practiced real estate law in private practice for over 30 years. And I can think of no one better to highlight the gross overreach by Mayor Eric Adams and other officials in New York attempting to usurp local zoning laws than Teresa Kenney. Any claim that our border is secure, you need not look further than New York, where New York City has taken in over 65,000 migrants since this crisis exacerbated last year. The governor and the mayor are asking for an emergency declaration. They have nowhere else to house these migrants. So the idea that we do not have open borders is laughable on its face. Couple that with New York's sanctuary city policy, and you have a recipe for disaster in New York City, and it is spilling out into communities all across New York State. And that is why Teresa Kenney's testimony here today is invaluable to this committee.
Thank you. And then we will finally hear from Ms. Tammy Nobles. Ms. Nobles is a realtor from Norfolk, Virginia. She volunteers part-time as the president of the Down Syndrome Association of Hampton Roads, and she is the mother of Kayla Hamilton. We welcome our witnesses. We thank them for appearing today, and we'll begin by swearing you in. Would you please rise and raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and you can be seated. Please know that your written testimony will be entered in the record in its entirety. Accordingly, we'd ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. And we'll begin with Chief Rodney Scott. You want to turn your mic on?
Oh, sorry, looked like it was on. I apologize. Chairman McClintock, Ranking Member Jayapal, Chairman Jordan, and Ranking Member Nadler. And members of the committee, thank you for having me here today. I am currently a senior distinguished fellow for Border Security and Immigration at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. But as stated, before joining Texas Public Policy, I served 29 years as a United States Border Patrol agent. I started out as a GS-5 Border Patrol agent trainee and was competitively promoted through the civil service ranks and was ultimately promoted to chief. I served as President Biden's chief of U.S. Border Patrol until I retired in August 2021. I think it's important to know I was never a political appointee. Over my career, I was honored to participate in the transformation of an uncontrolled, chaotic southwest border to a border that was increasingly secure. Meaningful progress started in 1994 under the Clinton administration when a strategy proposed by U.S. Border Patrol was adopted. That strategy used focused personnel deployments, barriers, technology, and consequences for violations of law to reduce the chaos of illegal immigration and free up agents to focus on public safety threats. The basic principles of this successful strategy endured every presidential administration until January 2021. My firsthand experiences taught me that border security and immigration are two distinctly different yet interrelated issues. Border security is simply knowing and controlling who and what is entering our homeland. Immigration and customs laws are completely irrelevant if you cannot control the initial entry. The terrorist attacks on 9/11 also had a profound impact on my understanding of border security. Prior to 9/11, terrorism was not part of the Border Patrol's discussions, but this changed as our nation realized that foreign terrorists had exploited vulnerabilities in our border security. Congress responded quickly by creating the Department of Homeland Security, and I responded by accepting an opportunity to build the Office of Anti-Terrorism within Customs and Border Protection. I quickly found myself immersed in classified intelligence briefings and interagency planning to mitigate terrorist threats. The terrorists that perpetrated 9/11 entered through our ports of entry, and as such, our priority was improving the ports of entry. But we knew that as we mitigated those vulnerabilities, terrorists would predictably shift to entering in between the ports of entry. We also had reason to believe that the terrorist organizations would increasingly seek operatives that were unknown to U.S. intelligence, so we could not rely solely on records checks. We would need skilled interviewers. The Border Patrol strategy evolved with an increased focus on situational awareness through intelligence and physical surveillance. However, deterring illegal immigration through a certainty of arrest and application of consequences remained a fundamental pillar. When I was selected as chief, the capabilities of the Border Patrol to detect and interdict illegal entries was better than ever, and it was rapidly improving. Fewer illegal entries combined with the construction of the new border wall system made every agent more effective. This equated to additional time that agents were spending on interviews to identify somebody positively, as well as their intent, and to glean intelligence on criminal networks that was used to improve investigations and operations. In contrast, I also experienced the reversal of border security and immigration policy that was initiated by the Biden administration. From day one, political leadership ignored career professionals and increasingly made policy decisions that resulted in thousands of aliens being released into the United States. As predicted, the volume of illegal immigration rapidly increased. It overwhelmed the Border Patrol and effectively transferred control of the United States border with Mexico to the drug cartels. I watched border security gains that had been made over 3 decades vanish and the safety of border communities spiral backwards. Policymakers must understand this is not simply an immigration issue. This is a national security threat. Cartels use illegal aliens to overwhelm law enforcement, create controllable gaps in border security that then they exploit to bring in anything they want. To think that well-resourced terrorist networks and hostile nations are not exploiting the same vulnerability is naive. Prioritizing immigration processing over enforcement also means that the agents are spread so thin when they are deployed that even when they detect an illegal entry, they are not always able to interdict it. These events are reported by the Border Patrol as known gotaways. But it's also important to know that this does not encompass the total gotaways. The hundreds of miles of border that are left unpatrolled on a daily or weekly basis now, and that lack persistent surveillance, we have no idea what it's crossed through those areas. In my professional assessment, the U.S. Border Patrol has lost our ability to know who and what is entering our homeland. And please remember, the border is simply a transit location, it is not a destination. These people and these things are going to every city, town, and state across this nation. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Next, we'll hear from Mr. Mark Hetfield.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Jayapal, and members of the subcommittee, I thank you for this opportunity to join you today to speak about securing our border. HIAS, founded over 120 years ago as the Hebrew Immigrants Aid Society, is the oldest refugee organization in the world. We were founded to help refugees because they were Jewish. Today, we help refugees because we are Jewish. We resettle refugees across the United States in partnership with the United States government and Jewish communities. We also operate in 22 other countries, half of which are in Latin America, working to help refugees find welcome and safety in their countries of asylum. HIAS is old enough to remember the importance of American leadership in drafting the Refugee Convention of 1951 and the Refugee Act of 1980, which passed this chamber and was signed into law with strong bipartisan support. These landmark measures were intended to ensure that never again would people fleeing persecution be turned back to their persecutors. Today, however, our asylum and immigration and border protection systems are in dire need of investment, updating, and repair. We can all agree that the status quo is absolutely unacceptable. Congress has not addressed legal immigration pathways in over 3 decades. The pretext for not doing so is that we cannot fix legal immigration pathways until we fix the border. This is a false choice, ignoring the laws of supply and demand. We cannot fix the border without also reforming legal immigration pathways. As long as there are jobs to fill that American citizens cannot or will not do, the U.S. government will not be able to secure the border. Congress needs to establish more pathways. As long as the government continues to invest in immigration enforcement officers without investing in immigration judges and asylum officers and in a more fair and efficient asylum system, we will not be able to secure the border. Otherwise, people will continue to apply for asylum and be assigned a court date many years into the future. As long as the system continues to leave people in limbo for decades, like TPS recipients, streamers, humanitarian parolees, and people who have withholding of removal, with no pathway to permanent residence or family reunion, you will not be able to secure the border. So long as it's difficult for asylum seekers to access legal counsel, you won't be able to secure the border because they will not have access to advice on whether or not they qualify and should proceed with their application. HIAS welcomes the Biden administration's announcement that it is establishing resettlement processing centers in South and Central America. In order to secure the border, we need such safe and legal pathways for fleeing for their lives to access resettlement, but as a safer complement to asylum, not as a substitute. Similarly, we welcomed the Biden administration's earlier decision to reopen the Central American Minors Program so children will no longer have to risk their lives to reunite with family across the border. Separating families, pushing people back without a hearing for their asylum claims, and subjecting asylum seekers to inhumane conditions on both sides of the border in detention shames us, but will not deter people from coming here as they have no better options. My written testimony details the story of one highest client in Mexico from Venezuela who, after struggling with the glitchy CBP-1 app, was locked in Mexican immigration detention in March in Juarez when the fire broke out, where detainees were locked in their cells and could not escape. 40 people were killed, but he survived by keeping his head in the toilet throughout the ordeal. He's now in the United States receiving medical treatment for the burns all over his body. My written statement provides details on Hayes's proposed approaches to the many challenges at the border. I cannot overemphasize, however, that there are no easy or cheap solutions to make up for decades of underinvestment, neglect, and polarization around this issue. We hope we can rely on the administration and Congress and this subcommittee to find bipartisan solutions that provide the legal pathways and the enforcement mechanisms necessary to restore equilibrium and integrity to our asylum and immigration systems. In the meantime, there need to be additional resources at the border and within our asylum system, but those resources cannot be solely focused on apprehension, removal, and detention, or on removal without a screening. The administration should not replace one legal fiction, barring asylum seekers on health grounds, with another, barring them because they did not go through asylum systems that are even more dysfunctional than our own. In the immediate term, the administration and Congress should focus on increasing resources for the fair and efficient adjudication of asylum claims on a last-in and first-out basis, with legal counseling and measures to ensure that CBP follows the law and their own procedures to ensure that no one is sent back into harm's way. The refugee admissions program should be resourced to be safe and orderly for pathways so that people can rely on U.S. law rather than on smugglers. We are not the only country facing this humanitarian challenge, and we cannot solve it alone. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll next hear from Supervisor Teresa Kenney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and every member of the subcommittee for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today about what transpired with Mayor Eric Adams and his efforts to house migrants in a local hotel in Orangetown, New York. I'm here today as the town supervisor of Orangetown, a suburban community approximately 30 miles north of New York City, to give you some insight into what is happening around the country as a result of the migration crisis at the southern border. It is important to note at the onset that what is happening in Orangetown is not unique. It is playing out throughout communities all over our country as major cities are reaching capacity for migrant housing, and they are sending them to other communities without any regard for whether they have the resources or capabilities to handle them. Orangetown's story began on Friday, May 5th, when New York City Mayor Adams called to tell me about a pilot program he was implementing as part of his decompression strategy. The plan, he explained, was to relocate migrants from New York City and to house them in hotels all across New York State. His call was to let me know that a hotel in Orangetown had been identified as a possible location. Mayor Adams downplayed the plan, telling me there was a chance that no one would be housed in Orangetown, and he implied it would be happening in weeks. When pressed for specifics, he told me that a member of his team would get back to me. I received a call from a member of the mayor's staff, and that's when I learned that the plan was to house single adult males in a local hotel and that the buses would be arriving imminently. In fact, it was within hours of that call that I received photos of hundreds of mattresses stacked outside the Armoni Inn and Suites Hotel, and it was evident to me that the plan had been in the works for quite some time, and that it included giving local elected officials very little advance notice as a means to thwart legal challenges. Throughout the following days, it became clear that the New York City intended to house 340 men at the Armoni Inn and Suites, a local hotel in Orangeburg, a small hamlet of just over 3 square miles and a population of approximately 4,500 people. The hotel is situated less than a mile from 2 college campuses, 2 senior citizen housing complexes, and a high school. It is located at the intersection of New York State Route 303, which is one of the most dangerous highways in the county, and Kings Highway, a street of mostly residential homes. Mayor Adams' plan was simple: to convert the hotel in Orangetown into a housing facility for long-term residents, or in other words, to open a New York City homeless shelter in Orangetown, which is a clear violation of our local zoning standards. So based upon this information and what was garnered from the phone calls and the observations of medical supplies and other shelter items by town officials, who inspected the property, the town issued a notice of violation to advise the hotel that it was not consistent with the definition of a hotel as set forth in our town code. Despite the issuance of the notice of violation, on Tuesday, May 9th, New York City scheduled a debriefing call with elected officials to tell us that they would be sending buses the next day. They also described conditions consistent with a shelter, in that there would be on-site staff available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, including one social worker and one caseworker per migrant for 30 migrants, and that New York City would cover the cost of 3 meals, laundry, service, and housekeeping for up to 4 months. They also introduced us to the staff from .go, a company that New York City had contracted with, which specializes in providing medical-related services to shelters. In light of this, the town filed legal papers in Rockland County Supreme Court and retained a restraining order against the hotel on Tuesday, May 9th, effectively preventing the use of the hotel as a shelter and the arrival of any migrants from New York City the next day. To be very clear, for our purposes, the immigration status of the individuals is irrelevant to the town's decision to seek legal recourse. The town sought legal action to ensure the integrity of local zoning regulations and the protection of those who would be housed in the hotel on a long-term basis as a shelter, as well as the community at large. I also want to outright reject any charges made that it is an act of anti-immigration. Rockland County is home to a vibrant immigrant population, and in fact, I'm married to one. But over the last 2 years, there's been a steady increase of migrants finding their way to Rockland County and settling in with the support of family, friends, and local community groups. This has already started to put a strain on Rockland County and Rockland County Department of Social Services. So much so that just over 2 months ago, Congressman Mike Lawler and County Executive Ed Day held a press conference and, standing with nonprofits, explained the financial impacts on Rockland County. The problem with Mr. Adams' plan is that he does not have one. That became evident when, during the debriefing call, a member of staff was asked about what would happen with the migrants at the end of the 4 months. The response was that they expected them to integrate into the community by that time. But Orangetown, like the rest of New York State, is in a housing crisis, affordability crisis. So the question is, how are these men, without English skills, without family support, going to integrate into our community? So I will tell you what will happen. They will end up renting from unscrupulous landlords. And we know what's happening because just this past March, there was a tragic house fire in Rockland that killed 5 undocumented immigrants, including 2 children, with 5 others being hospitalized. Orange and Rockland County just do not have the resources or staffing levels to investigate and remedy these types of situations on a wide-scale basis. Without the federal government acting to stem the flow of migrants at the border, it was only a matter of time before it impacted all of our neighborhoods. While it is Orangetown today, it will be yours tomorrow. Thank you, and I look forward to answering questions.
Thank you. And finally, we'll hear from Mrs. Tammy Nobles. Ms. Nobles, you've already heard from several of our colleagues. Our hearts go out to you, as do the hearts of every American who hears your story. I know that grief always feels very alone, but I want to assure you you're not alone, and you're now recognized to tell your story.
Thank you to the members of the committee for having me. My name is Tammy Nobles. I am the mother of Kayla Hamilton. July 24th, 2002 was one of the best days of my life. I gave birth to a beautiful baby girl and named her Kayla Marie. She was a happy and easygoing baby. Even back then, she loved to smile and laugh. She always kept her friends close and never forgot anyone. She was kind, caring, thoughtful, and funny. She loved life and God. She showed the world that being yourself was okay, and you didn't have to follow everyone else. But sadly, on July 27th, 2022, I received the worst news that a parent doesn't want to hear, that my newly 20-year-old daughter, Kayla Hamilton, was murdered in her own room and left on the floor like trash. She left behind a mother who loved her, a stepfather, a brother, a younger sister, grandparents, and lots of aunts, uncles, and cousins. At first, we knew very little details of the murder until an arrest was made. The details we learned broke us. At the end of March of 2022, Kayla's murderer was apprehended by Border Patrol crossing illegally into the U.S. at the southwest border in Rio Grande City, Texas. I am not sure if he was vetted or not, but he was a 16-year-old known gang member affiliated with MS-13 in El Salvador. The MS-13 motto is kill, rape, and control. He entered the country as an unoccupied alien child. As a UAC, the murderer was allowed to go live with his aunt in Frederick, Maryland. She was also an illegal immigrant. There were issues with him living there, and he went to go live with his half-brother who lived in the same trailer park as Kayla and her boyfriend. My questions are, what protocol was the aunt supposed to follow? If she couldn't handle him, then why not inform the proper authorities? The half-brother tried to get him a job and to do the right thing, but that didn't happen. So the half-brother told him that he had to leave. At the trailer park, an illegal immigrant owned numerous trailers and was subletting them out. That is how Kayla was able to get a place, because she didn't make much and had no credit yet. The half-brother asked the owner if she had any rooms for rent. She did. The same trailer as Kayla. Kayla's murderer was living there less than 5 days before he viciously murdered my daughter. Kayla had 2 jobs. She was working at a cleaning company and at a grocery store. Kayla had autism, but she was determined to live independently and make her way in this world. And my baby paid the ultimate price. She had just gotten home from work, working the night shift, and said goodbye to her boyfriend that morning when he left for work. She then went to sleep. The murderer went into Kayla's room, strangling her, grabbed her iPod charger, and wrapped it around her throat and face while strangling her to death. Kayla grabbed her phone and called her boyfriend, but went to voicemail. The voicemail of the murderer strangling her was 2 minutes and 30 seconds long. The murderer then violently sexually assaulted Kayla. Kayla's boyfriend came home from work and found her dead on the floor. The charger cord was so tight around her neck and face that her boyfriend had to use his teeth to get it off. The murderer robbed her of her phone and $6. $6 is all my baby had in cash because she used the snack machines at work to get something to eat. He then went to lunch with his half-brother like nothing happened. Local police didn't have enough evidence to arrest the murderer, so Child Protective Services took him into custody and placed him in an unsecured children's home with other children, even knowing that he was a main suspect in a premeditated murder case. When he was arrested for Kayla's murder, he laughed and smirked. For me, this is not a political issue. This is a safety issue for everyone living in the United States. This could have been anyone's daughter. Kayla wasn't doing anything wrong, and she didn't deserve to be murdered. I don't want any other parent to live the nightmare that I am living. I am her voice now, and I am going to fight with everything I have to get her story told and bring awareness of the issue at the border. I will make sure her memory lives on. Murder itself is already taboo, but then you mention MS-13 and nobody wants to touch it. Nothing will change if nobody talks about the problem. The United States government has to secure our border. We need to properly vet all border crossers. The government could have placed a phone call to authorities in El Salvador and found out that he was a gang member, but they didn't. If we had stricter border policies, my daughter would still be alive today. Nothing will bring my daughter back, nor the pain, nor fix the pain. I'm not having her here, but I want to prevent this from happening to someone else's child. This is about protecting everyone here in the United States. Thank you.
We'll now proceed with the 5-minute rule with questions. I'm going to defer mine to the end and recognize Mr. Biggs of Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Nobles, thank you again for being here. Thank all the witnesses, but thank you for your poignant testimony. I think of Steve Ronnebeck, whose son Grant was murdered as he worked at a convenience store in Mesa, Arizona, by an illegal alien. Or Marianne Mendoza, whose son Brandon, as a police officer, was killed by an illegal alien in Mesa, Arizona. Our heart goes out to you, Mrs. Nobles. I'm stunned that a witness would say we need to find equilibrium at a time when 6 million plus people have illegally entered the country in the last 2 years. I'm stunned. I'm stunned to know that of 32,000 people 21,000 of them were released into the country over a 72 to 96-hour period. I'm stunned because we don't have control of our border. The CBP Chief Ortiz has testified that the cartels control our border, as has Sector Chief Maudlin of the Tucson sector, as has Sector Chief Chavez of the Rio Grande Valley sector. I'll go to you, Chief Scott. Has Secretary Mayorkas taken the actions necessary and appropriate to achieve and maintain operational control of the borders?
Absolutely not, sir. If you listen to the words he states every time, it's about creating safe pathways. When I was chief, we were not allowed to even discuss consequences or actually securing the border. It was all about expediting the processing and avoiding the optics of people backed up into Border Patrol stations.
We've heard today about new parole processes being implemented. Last year, over 300,000 people received parole. This year, it'll be over 750,000. Prior to the Biden administration, typically you might see 15 to 20, maybe 20, as high as 25 parole processes. That's because that's an individual process. Even Secretary Mayorkas has testified before this committee that it's an individual process. What has he done to distort the parole process, Chief Scott?
I honestly do not understand how they can look at the law and do what they're currently doing with the parole process. By law, every one of those approvals is supposed to be a case-by-case basis. It's supposed to be based on humanitarian reason or a benefit to the United States government. In my entire time in the Border Patrol, I probably approved, and I'm estimating, about 6 or 8 paroles a year at the most, and those were usually to benefit a case or because of some type of a medical condition. But there were tight restrictions put on every one of those. There's probably a packet about 1 inch thick about keeping track of the individual, because the concept of parole is you're allowing someone into the United States that we know does not have a legal right to be here. They haven't proven it. So we're accepting risk on behalf of all of America. That's a heavy burden. We all took that very seriously. I do not believe the Border Patrol can be doing today the legal assessment required for each individual case. It's just not possible.
Chief Scott, DHS officials, and I'm quoting now from a New York Times piece, say thousands of migrants are successfully using CBP-1 instead of paying smugglers, close quote. Are we to believe that CBP-1 is an alternative to cartel smuggling, or are we actually using CBP-1 to facilitate cartel smuggling?
There's CBP-1 app is, from my understanding, is basically a queuing mechanism like we used to do at ports of entry with a pen and paper on the south side. Anything that happens on the south side of that border is definitely controlled or influenced heavily by the cartel. Anything we can do to get them out of the system would be fine, but I think the piece that we're missing here too is we're now taking away from the legal trade and travel processes of the CBP officers at those ports of entry. They were all gainfully employed prior, and the CBP-1 app is pushing more and more people into that port of entry that don't have, by definition, do not have a legal right to be here. The other challenge is it's a magnet, because to use the CBP-1 app, again, from my understanding, you have to be in Mexico, you have to be up close to the border. So that entices even more people into that border community, and the throughput does not match the demand. And where does that overage go? Right back to the cartels.
Thank you. My time's expired.
Chair now recognizes the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hetfield, thank you for your very compelling testimony. As you know, one of the Biden administration's answers to increase migration at the border is to expand legal pathways. As Title 42 was set to expire earlier this month, the United States announced its opening of regional processing centers all over the hemisphere. They will be starting in Guatemala and Colombia, and then expanding to other countries, including Mexico. This seems like a positive step by the administration to build up its capacity to take increased numbers of refugees before they ever even make that dangerous journey to our southern border. Would you agree with that? And what do you think the United States needs to do to make these regional processing centers a success?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, I also agree with Chief Scott's assessment about the overuse of parole. The administration needs to rely more on the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program as a lawful pathway, with a pathway to permanent residence and ultimately citizenship and suitable vetting, and less on humanitarian parole. And this is definitely a step in the right direction, so I hope those centers are resourced. One of the key strategies that's going to have to be implemented, though, is you have to make those centers for asylum seekers with legitimate claims more attractive than crossing the border to seek asylum. So you have to look at things that have been used in the past with the refugee program, like the Lautenberg Amendment, and apply that to their applications. You have to make sure that that their applications are processed expeditiously and fairly. So yes, but I'm absolutely supportive of that measure.
If you listen to my colleagues, you would think that the United States is bearing the brunt of the global refugee crisis alone. HIAS works all over the world, as you said. It's simply not true. Can you discuss how other countries in the hemisphere are seeing significant increases in the number of asylum claims?
Yeah, absolutely, and it really is a global refugee crisis, and we are just one player in this global refugee crisis. I mean, Colombia alone, which was traditionally a refugee-producing country, is now taking in refugees. Millions of Venezuelans, over 2.5 million Venezuelans have sought refuge in Colombia, where HIAS operates. Likewise, over 1.5 million in Peru, over 500,000 in Ecuador. Over nearly 500,000 in Chile. I mean, if you look at every single country in the hemisphere, there are many asylum seekers, most of them coming from Venezuela, but also from Central America and even outside of the Western Hemisphere seeking asylum. And so this really requires international attention, and the U.S. has to lead on this issue.
And it's my understanding that HIAS is actually helping some of these individuals apply for asylum in other countries. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. I mean, HIAS's number one job is to make asylum seekers safe and secure and welcome wherever they are. And that's in the first countries to which they flee. And when that fails, then we try to find them third countries, but again, through safe and orderly means like refugee resettlement. Our operations have expanded massively over the last few years because of the refugee crisis and the Venezuelan migration crisis in particular throughout the Western Hemisphere.
And as you pointed out, refugee admissions and the need to assist refugees has always been a bipartisan concern until recently. In fact, I remember the testimony of somebody from the National Evangelical Association saying that our refugee resettlement program is the crown jewel of humanitarian assistance. Mr. Hetfield, I wanted to see if you could discuss misinformation and how it spreads among migrants who are making the long journey to the border. Can you discuss how rumors and misinformation spread by the cartels of an open border impacts the number of migrants that we see trying to come to the United States?
Sure, and it's massive, but it's not all misinformation. I mean, they're spreading misinformation and also information about how broken our border and our immigration system is. And that is an attractant to people to come in, to apply for asylum and other benefits to which many of them are not actually entitled.
Thank you, Mr. Hetfield. I couldn't agree more. I think our words matter, and I think that you're pointing out of the importance of really establishing a functioning immigration system is absolutely crucial. As the ranking member of the full committee said in his opening statement, it is unfortunately seen as an advantage by many of our colleagues across the aisle to leave our immigration system broken so that we can continue to point fingers at immigrants who are simply trying to do what so many of our forebearers have done, come to the United States because it is a country that has protected so many people fleeing terrible persecution and many other ills. I thank you for your testimony today and for being with us. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The chair recognizes Mr. Tiffany from Wisconsin for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chief Scott, isn't it correct that many of these people are not asylum seekers, that they're actually not legitimate asylees?
That is very accurate. Most of them, when you ask them questions, they're economic refugees. If anything, they're seeking work
Isn't it
They're not
correct?
political.
Isn't it correct when Remain in Mexico was in place under the previous administration, there was over 90% that rejected they were not legitimate asylees?
That is correct, and that also acted as a deterrent, so people stopped coming to the border because they knew they couldn't get away with fraud.
Yeah, just for the record, Mr. Chairman, I was down at the Darien Gap 2 years ago at this time in May, and that's exactly what we heard. People were coming. They were like, we had resettled to Chile, and we were perfectly happy there. We resettled to Brazil, Haitians, others, Venezuelans. They said, we were perfectly happy there, but since you're going to open the border, we're going to come to the United States of America. That's not a legitimate asylum claim, is it?
That is not.
With Secretary Mayorkas, has he done his job to protect the American people?
I do not believe that he has. He's focused on the processing and completely ignored border security, which, by the way, actually decimates our immigration system. Good border security supports our good immigration system.
Mrs. Nobles, if border policies continue as they are over the last 2 years, will there be more Kaylas?
Yes, I believe so. And that is why I'm trying to get her story out so people are aware of the issue.
Might Kayla be alive if the Biden administration had secured the border over the last 2 years?
Yes, I believe she would still be here if he was properly vetted.
Would you prefer from us, if you had a choice, to get condolences from members, which I'm sure are very heartfelt, would you prefer condolences or would you prefer changes in the law like the Secure the Border Act? I would like to have changes in the law, and I want to put a law in Kayla's name to help, to have her memory live on, and so those will know that she was the one that could, that changed the law. Unfortunately, Mr. Chairman, we have a name for these people, angel families, and that is a horrible thing here in America that we have such a thing, that we have to name all those people that have been killed by people who came in here illegally into our country. I want to go back to you, Mr. Scott. Have you had a chance to see the grand jury presentment in Florida? Have you reviewed that?
I have not reviewed it in its entirety, no.
Would it surprise you, out of that presentment, a 24-year-old male was processed by the Office of Refugee Resettlement and went on to violently kill his sponsor by stabbing him 50 times? Would it be surprised that that person came in as a minor but actually was a 24-year-old male? Is that surprising to you?
It is not surprising. I'm familiar with that case. There's no database that we can check people's ages off of, so you have to go with their word.
Would you be surprised, out of that presentment, that many don't carry any form of identification or authentic IDs?
I'm not surprised. Usually they get rid of it before they cross the border.
Are you surprised that UACs, unaccompanied alien children, are not rapid DNA tested or biometric tested?
To be honest, they're not even fingerprinted and photographed in many occasions if they're under 14, so no.
Would you be surprised to know out of that presentment that most case managers at OR do not have any special training, and many have been hired over the phone, sight unseen, with a very cursory approach?
That's very troubling, but unfortunately I'm not surprised.
Would you be surprised that agents in the El Paso region discovered more than 665 adult illegal aliens in 2021 alone who tried to pose as unaccompanied minors to gain expedited entry into the United States in the past 12 months?
I'm not surprised. Anytime you carve out a special group, people try to take advantage of that and lie and get into it.
Would you be surprised if an OR attorney, the Office of Refugee and Resettlement, stated, we only get sued for keeping them too long. We don't get sued by traffickers.
I'm not surprised, and that is consistent with what I was told and heard during my time as chief in this administration.
Thank you to all the people that are here today. I would just close. We heard all kinds of data from the ranking member here in his presentation. Over the course of 3 decades, I believe it added up to about 233,000 people came in via parole. That was over the course of 3 decades. We've had over 1 million people come in, Mr. Chairman, in just a little over 2 years. That is not humane in any way. Terrorists, human traffickers, and fentanyl poisonings are a product of what has happened under the Biden administration and Secretary Mayorkas. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Nadler for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hetfield, our Republican colleagues use a lot of inflammatory rhetoric, calling migrants arriving at the southern border an invasion. Can you discuss the impact this kind of language has on the work that you and Hayes do?
Yeah, that's a difficult topic. It's had a significant impact, especially as a Jewish agency. First of all, there's the vilification of undocumented immigrants and asylum seekers, which is having a major impact on the agency, on security issues regarding the agency, and on relationships with the people that we deal with. The vast majority of asylum seekers are coming here because they are fleeing persecution. Many people who come here are not in need of protection, but that's why we need a system that makes that distinction. We don't have one right now. But in terms of HIAS itself, unfortunately, the theory of replacement theory is gaining more and more mainstream attention, which is that there is a conspiracy by Jews and others to bring in brown people and non-Christian people to replace white Christian Americans. This is becoming a serious problem for us. It's gaining more and more mainstream acceptance, and I'm not really sure what to do with that.
Thank you. The United States, along with others in the hemisphere, recently signed the Los Angeles Declaration on Migration and Protection. As part of the declaration, the United States committed to taking 20,000 refugees over the next 2 years from the hemisphere. This feels like a start, but seems wholly inadequate given that 7 million people are displaced from Venezuela alone. Would you agree, and can the United States be doing more to take refugees from the hemisphere?
Yeah, absolutely. We're very late to that. As I said, many other countries are accepting many Venezuelans in much larger numbers than we are through more efficient processes. And Venezuelans now make up the #1 population in the United States for asylum seekers. I mean, it is a hemispheric problem that needs a hemispheric solution, and we need to be part of that strategy. And accepting more through the refugee resettlement program, again, a safe and orderly program, is the best way to go.
Thank you. Can you discuss how the United States stepping up its refugee program can have a positive impact on the number of asylum seekers we see at the U.S. border?
Right. It needs to be done, in conjunction with having an asylum system that gives, that's efficient and that gives responses quickly and makes decisions quickly. But it provides a safe and legal pathway for people who need protection, and therefore discourages them from taking their lives at risk trying to cross the border to get that protection. It's absolutely a necessary safety valve and legal pathway. And unfortunately, the Biden administration has not yet succeeded in rebuilding that program. As you know, the refugee resettlement admissions ceiling last year was 125,000, and we fell 100,000 short of that.
Thank you. Barriers to work authorization have devastating consequences for arriving migrants and local communities, which is one reason there has been bipartisan support for improving access to work permits and addressing lengthy processing backlogs. What does Congress and the administration need to do to support local employers and improve access to work authorization?
Well, this is a really vexing problem where asylum seekers are not allowed to accept employment, nor are they allowed to receive any assistance while their asylum application is pending for a minimum of 6 months. In many cases, it's much, much longer than that. So basically, they have to find a way to support themselves, and there are no legal means for doing so. So that is a system that is destined to fail. The H.R. 1325, the Asylum Seeker Work Authorization Act of 2023, does provide a solution. So I would urge that or similar measures be supported.
Thank you. My final question is, we heard the story of the person who murdered Mrs. Noble's daughter. Now, this person, I gather, came in as an unaccompanied minor. Has any change been made between the Trump and Biden administrations that would have affected the ability of an unaccompanied minor to come into this country and what he would do afterwards?
I mean, many changes have been made by the administration. That the Trump administration was, as you know, pushing minors back at the border. So, but the bottom line is that this goes back to the other parts of my testimony, which is that we need a system where control does not stop at the border but continues into the United States. And right now we're not properly resourcing the system to do that, including, as the New York Times recently exposed, with regard to the treatment of unaccompanied minors.
Thank you.
Thank you. My time has expired. I yield back.
Mr. Van Drew.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, here we go again, addressing the continued policy failures of this administration at the border. And as our border descends further into chaos, I can't help but worry that this nation is becoming increasingly comfortable with accepting weakness, not accepting the rule of law, and accepting it all as our new normal. An acceptance of weakness that led to the highest number of border encounters in a single day ever. And by the way, there was a comment from somebody from the other side, and they said that, you know, Republicans enjoy this because they can use it as political fodder. Let's be clear. The Democrats were in control for 2 years. They had the presidency, they had the Senate, they had the House of Representatives. They could have done anything. They could have made this better. They could have straightened it out. It wasn't a split. But they didn't. That's the reality. So let's talk about what's really true, and that's not just talk, political talk that doesn't make sense. An acceptance of weakness has turned every town in America, from El Paso, Texas, to Orange County, California, New York, into a de facto border town. An acceptance of weakness that has turned public parks, police stations, and school gymnasiums into makeshift shelters. Tell me that's good for America. Anybody sitting out there right now, you tell me that that's good for our America. An acceptance of weakness that led to the tragic case of Kayla Hamilton, where an MS-13 gang member was allowed into our country as a supposed, quote, unaccompanied minor, end quote, despite a history of criminal activity and of violence. Tell me that's good for our America. If you have strong borders, if you don't have strong borders, you are not a strong nation. Every country in the world basically has strong borders. Third world countries have stronger borders than we do right now. If this administration cannot protect its citizens, they are not worthy of the authority Americans have trusted them with. And personally, I do not think that Secretary Mayorkas is worthy, and I do not think our president is. If you continue to accept the weakness we are witnessing, you are surrendering the very foundations of our democracy, the disregard for our laws. We're not a nation of the rule of law anymore. Think about the premise in which we argue, discuss, and debate this. It's against the law to illegally enter the country. It's against the law. You've broken the law. I don't understand why the law doesn't matter anymore. Are we a nation of laws or are we not? That's the important question here. It's gotten so out of hand that our Secretary Mayorkas is celebrating 6,300 illegal encounters as a good day. That's a good day. Think about that. President Obama's Homeland Security Secretary once claimed that 1,000 encounters a day would be a crisis. But now 6,300 is a good day. Today it's a triumph. This is the acceptance of weakness consuming our nation, and it threatens the safety and well-being of each and every American, and we should not tolerate it, and we should change it. You can be a humane and good country, but still believe in the rule of law. And I wonder how Kayla's family feels about it all. I wonder if she thinks this is good. I have 3 quick questions for Chief Scott. With the number of crossings our country is experiencing, can Border Patrol properly debrief and access the information and intentions of every migrant trying to come across our border? Yes or no?
No.
Thank you. Do you believe it is easy for a terrorist to get into the United States undetected today than 5 years ago? Yes or no?
It definitely is.
Thank you. As thousands of illegal migrants are accepted into our country every day, there are less obvious threats to Americans that we aren't noticing yet, or are we looking into them enough? The question is, are we looking into these threats enough? Yes or no?
No, the Border Patrol barely has time to process who's in custody. They're leaving hundreds of miles of border unpatrolled every day. No.
Exactly. This is, and thank you, sir. Thank you for your work. This is a joke. Let's really talk about the real issue. It's the rule of law. It's the safety of our people. We're breaking the law, and we're becoming weaker, and we've got to stop it. Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes Mr. Correa of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, Ms. Nobles, I also want to express my condolences as a fellow parent. I also have a daughter, about the same age as your daughter. About 2 years ago, I got a phone call at home. I should say at work from home. My daughter was all alone at home. Called me screaming, crying, saying, "Daddy, there's 2 men in the house. 2 men were burglarizing the house. What do I do, Daddy?" And I said, "Stay by the dogs. Let me call 911. And those moments of terror, I hate to think what would have happened if those German Shepherds weren't there, or if our local Santa Ana PD had not gotten there in minutes. Ma'am, I can guarantee you that no one condones criminals in our streets with or without documents. This is about our families and the safety of our families. With or without documents, I do not condone anybody in our streets that would harm our families. Ms. Noble, my prayers are with your family. Thank you. And Mr. Chair, without objection, I'd like to submit for the record this Wall Street Journal article entitled, "What Everyone Except the USA Has Learned About Immigration as Washington Sits Divided, Our Global Rivals Lower Their Barriers to Ease Labor Shortages." Mr. Chairman?
That's right. Without objection.
Mr. Hetfield, if I may, COVID, the aftermath of COVID. It seems that the USA is again the world's economic locomotive. The world seems to be devastated economically. Even the great China, even the great economy is sputtering right now. I got a phone call the other day from the president of Guatemala asking for help with the refugee challenge Guatemala is facing. You mentioned Colombia, 2.4 Venezuelan refugees. Mexico is having a challenge. This is a worldwide phenomenon. You've already addressed it, but I want you to again repeat. Is this a U.S. challenge at this moment? We can look at this last 2 or 3 years and say this is wrong, but you've got to open it up beyond just the U.S. It's a worldwide phenomenon. Am I correct or not?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. I mean, the United States cannot solve this problem alone, but we're not going through it alone either. The global refugee crisis is over 120 million people right now.
I'm always tempted to say this is a refugee challenge like we haven't seen since World War II, when 60 million Europeans were on the move. Am I correct in that assessment?
Yeah, I mean, the actual number is double that in terms of forcibly displaced persons. So you're not incorrect at all. As a proportion of the world population, of course, it's smaller, but in absolute numbers, it's double.
Chief Scott, if I may ask you a question, sir. I want to say, first of all, you are doing an impossible job. Thank you for what you're doing. You know, the private sector in our society continues to be a magnet for workers. 60% of the individuals that come across blend into society. They have families they ride with. They blend into society. 50% of our farm workers are undocumented. I would say that as long as we don't have immigration reform that is sensible, that works for a private sector, the need for workers in this country is also a magnet. Would you say that or not?
I started out in the Immigration and Naturalization Service where I was taught border security supports our legal immigration system so that we can meet needs like that. They do go hand in hand, but I do point out that if you can't control the flow in any way, then you really can't, any kind of numbers or any kind of decisions you put at the other end are irrelevant. I do believe this country is based on immigration. I think everybody in the Border Patrol supports immigration. That's why they got in, but we support it legally.
And I agree with you. The problem is there is no way to get into work in this country right now. Our economy would suffer. Again, 50% of our farm workers being undocumented. I don't think anybody supports a policy to deport those workers because that would affect our food security. But I look forward to working with all of you and making sure we do some common sense reforms that are good for the American economy and the American people. Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, I yield.
Gentleman yields back.
Mr. Chairman?
For what purpose does the gentlelady seek recognition?
I have a unanimous consent request to enter the following statements into the record. Organizational statements from the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies, Church World Service, and National Immigration Forum.
Without objection.
Thank you.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Roy of Texas.
I thank the chairman. Mr. Scott, we were just told that we're unable to get workers into this country. True or false, we get somewhere around 1 million green cards every year, and we have seasonal workers that are able to come here and work under our current system under the law.
That's correct.
And currently at our border, what do we have right now in terms of our ability for Border Patrol to stop the flow between ports of entry? Or is it in fact that Border Patrol is processing people at the ports of entry?
The Border Patrol stays outside the ports of entry themselves, but the Border Patrol is literally, it's almost acting as a port because they're processing getaways and they're leaving hundreds of miles of border wide open.
For example, at a tent like in Eagle Pass, right, where you've got a 10-acre facility where you're processing 1,500 people a day. Is Border Patrol a part of that operation?
Yes, sir. Yes.
As opposed to actually being on the line and being able to go patrol the border between the ports of entry as they're supposed to do.
Correct. And there's been some numbers reported, but I think what's important is even if half of the Border Patrol agents are deployed to the field at the beginning of shift, within an hour or so, they're overwhelmed with thousands of more illegal aliens, and then they are processing as well, leaving the border wide open.
Chief Scott, do we know how much fentanyl or dangerous narcotics come in between our ports of entry or dangerous individuals?
We have no idea, but there's no shortage in Chicago or New York.
Right. So this claim by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle that all of the fentanyl comes in at the ports of entry, we literally don't know how much is coming in between the ports of entry because Border Patrol is unable to do its job while it's being overwhelmed by the failed policies of this administration. Is that true?
That is accurate. And if you look at the statistics, anytime illegal immigration across the border between the ports slows down, drug seizures actually increase because agents are actually out there identifying it.
Supervisor Kenny, your community has been dramatically impacted, right, by the number of individuals that have been dumped into your community. Can you quickly, because it's just a matter of time, explain how much that has negatively impacted your community?
I'm from Orangetown in Rockland County. We actually obtained a restraining order to prevent them from coming until it goes through the court system. The county just north of us has received hundreds and hundreds at this point, and I can't speak for them.
And you have had hotels filled up with often single males that are filling up places so that needy individuals aren't able to get facilities and aren't able to get the resources they need. Is that true?
Yeah, the goal of Mayor Adams was to send 340 single adult men to a hotel in my town. It's been put on hold by the courts.
And where is your town again?
In Orangetown, which is 30 miles north of New York City.
Okay, so not on the southern border of the United States.
No.
And so this is something we're dealing with, as my friend from Arizona, Mr. Biggs, knows, and my friend from California, Mr. McClintock, and others know on the border. We deal with it all the time in our communities in South Texas, but this is something that the entire country is now dealing with. And I'd like to now move to Ms. Nobles, and I cannot possibly put into words, Ms. Nobles, what you have experienced as a result of the failed policies of this country. I would simply ask, as carefully as I can, having met with numerous family members who have lost loved ones due to these failed policies, whether it's through violence, as you have unfortunately experienced, or whether it is through, for example, fentanyl poisonings that so many of our moms have experienced. I met with 3 fentanyl moms just 2 weeks ago in Austin, Texas. I've met with dozens. I've met with dozens of individuals who've lost loved ones, including a family member in San Antonio whose son was killed by an illegal immigrant who had been here, had been arrested, let go, arrested, let go, and then burned this woman's son to death. That's what we have going on in our country, while our colleagues on the other side of the aisle bury their head in the sand and pretend that somehow it's compassionate. I would just ask you, Ms. Nobles, to explain whether or not you've had interactions with other moms and family members who have had similar unfortunate experiences as a result of our failed policies.
Unfortunately, I haven't. I haven't seen anybody talk about their story or shared anything about, because I know Kayla wasn't the only one, but where are they? So that's why I'm standing up and talking about her story and getting her story out. At least I can speak for my child and make sure that I make people aware of what's going on.
Well, Ms. Nobles, I'm going to, after this hearing, connect you with angel families who have had a number of these experiences that they've put out, with the Vargas family in San Antonio who have been dealing with loss from these kinds of policies. And I would just ask Chief Scott, are the current policies stopping the kind of violence that can occur through having, for example, in this case, a UAC, an unaccompanied alien child, who ended up carrying out this crime that Ms. Nobles had to suffer from? I want to ask you that question, but I also just want to point out, and before you answer the question, and then I'll yield back, I just came back from the federal district courthouse because I went over there to support Jaime Zapata's family, because Jaime Zapata was gunned down by the cartels in 2011, and the sentencing is going on right now as we speak. Cartels are empowered at our border. They're empowered by China. They're empowered by our own federal government failing to do its job, and Americans are dying as a result, and so are migrants. Mr. Scott, if you can answer that question, and then I'll yield back.
The current crisis is making it impossible to be able to weed out the criminals, especially the UACs, from anyone else. The agents don't have time to do face-to-face interviews. There's no global database of criminal records.
Thank you, Chief Scott.
Mr. Chairman, I seek unanimous consent on various articles to put a piece from the New York Times dated April 23rd, Biden opens a new back door on immigration, the Navajo Nation requesting answers to questions, border crossings down. This is Washington Post article from May 19th. Border crossings down, but many migrants released to U.S. to ease crowding. Breitbart piece entitled Human Smuggler Drops Preschool-Aged Child Over California Border Wall, dated today's date, as well as a piece dated today, Georgia Democrat slams party for favoring migrants over Americans.
Without objection.
Thank you.
Chair now recognizes Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas.
Chairman, and to the ranking member, as one would expect, Ms. Nobles, and I'm over here. Ms. Nobles, I'm in this direction.
Oh.
I don't. As a mother, I couldn't say anything less than the pain that I know that you're experiencing. I could say my heart goes out to you, but I want to acknowledge the pain for any mother, any family to lose their precious child. I want your daughter's story to be heard. And if we can work in a bipartisan way, I will sign on to any bill that enhances her heroic story. I think that's what you are surviving on. What a young woman, wanting to be independent, working 2 jobs, holding her head up high. A vicious act. Forgive me if I say this is not solely immigration, poor police work, to be honest with you. But frankly, we wanted that not to happen. And no one on this panel is champion MS-13. I can tell you that. And so we've got to find a way to decipher, discern, to weed out. Because if there is a mother trying to come with just to work in the fields, I know that that may not be the best way for her to come, but that is not the MS-13. They don't deserve to be in this country, period. So let me just, I don't want to say thank you because you're here in pain, but just want you to know I think her story has to be told. Thank you for your presence here today. Chief, I assume we served overlapping. I'm not sure. What years were you? You're retired, so what years have you served, sir?
As the chief, it was February 2020 until August of 2021, but I was Border Patrol agent for over 29 years.
Okay, starting what year?
1992.
Yeah. So you've had several leaders, presidents, and then, of course, Homeland Security came into being after 9/11. I was on the committee in its origins and know just about every one of your Border Patrol leaders. Would you say that it would be better to approach immigration reform, Republicans and Democrats, in a terminology that we've coined under the late John McCain, comprehensive immigration reform, which in essence deals with border security on the north and the south and recognizing legal pathways for entry? Would you accept that would be a better approach?
I believe border security is exactly like your home. It gets overcomplicated a lot of times in the public discussion, but it's exactly like your home. We just need people to come through the front door in a legal manner. Congress gets to pick who those people are, not the Border Patrol.
So my time is short. I want you to answer the question specifically. Comprehensive immigration reform with border security and legal pathways. Would you accept that?
Based on my experience, the border security has to come first.
Well, let me, I can't put words in your mouth, but you're not going to get border security coming first. You need to be able to balance it. You would not accept a border security and recognizing pathways to legal entry?
Based on my experience and looking at the 86 IRA, you have to be able to secure the border first, or all the other conversations are irrelevant.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think reasonably, Mr. Hetfield, as you understand, when John McCain, the late John McCain, we had a very strong comprehensive bill. And it had border security and the legal pathway. If we get stuck on border security, we're not listening to the witnesses here. We're not listening to the New York town that is frustrated with what's happening to them, rightly so. So let me just get you to this espouse because my time is going. First of all, your organization was affiliated with the Tree of Life, was it not? Or the attitude of that killer?
Yeah, I'd rather not discuss the Tree of Life because the prosecution is ongoing at this point.
Well, let me just say, since I went there, let me just say that the attitude was that Jews were bringing in migrants and immigrants. Is that true?
That is correct.
And it resulted in death, did it not?
That is correct.
All right, let me just get to the point of the work that you do, and that is if things change in the hemisphere so that more refugees are coming and you work with refugees to help the United States so they don't result in being lost or being in the wrong direction. And as well, I would assume that you abhor MS-13 as well. If you can answer those two questions, I'd appreciate it.
Absolutely and absolutely.
You got to say...
Yes. HIAS is entirely focused on legal pathways to bring people into the United States so they do not resort to fleeing across borders to seek asylum. We try to provide them with safe and legal alternatives to that, and in partnership with the U.S. government and Jewish communities. And absolutely, we need a system of control which can identify, vet, and detain and remove people who are a danger to the society.
The gentlelady's time
like MS-13.
Yes.
Chair recognizes
Are you
Mr.
back?
Moore of Alabama.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Certainly want to thank all the witnesses for being here today. You know, I've said this before and I'll say it again, that a closed border, a controlled border is actually a compassionate border. And not just for the migrants who get turned in to indentured servants or worse, but for the Americans that some of these illegal aliens harm. For example, in my district, 2nd Congressional District of Alabama, a couple weeks ago, Talga County Sheriff Department arrested Gravy Zavala, a 29-year-old illegal alien from Honduras, for the rape of a teenage girl in Prattville. It's alleged that he drug her into a bathroom in a restaurant. Press reports indicate that he entered the United States in November 2021 through Texas using a fake name, but was allowed to enter into this country In addition, according to the press reports, he had a criminal record in Honduras. I don't know how this is possibly acceptable. And Ms. Nobles, unfortunately, you and your family know this all too well. And I am terribly sorry for what happened to you and your daughter. I'm a proud father of 4. I got 2 girls and a granddaughter that'll be born probably by Friday, I understand. That's what the experts are saying. Anyway, we should never let this happen. And so, Mr. Hetfield, I want to kind of go to you initially. You said we got a lot of people coming to this country that are not qualified. What do you mean by that?
The only way for many people to come into this country is through the asylum system. That's the only way to be able to not be expeditiously removed at the border, is to claim a fear. So of course people are using that pathway if they're coming here for reasons that do not qualify them for asylum, such as they need to support themselves, they're trying to escape poverty, they're trying to reunite with family, which is why we need to have an asylum system that functions and efficiently determines whether or not somebody has a legitimate asylum claim or not.
Good. Mr. Hetfield, let me ask you this. I was in Yuma, Arizona. This is our 3rd hearing. We had one in the district in Yuma, or actually on the border. And the sheriffs informed us there that basically the border agents have become concierge. They're just giving these people motion to appear, an $800 taxpayer-funded subsidy and a cell phone. And then when we take their calls for court dates, they'll take our phones, but they're not taking our calls. Do you find that alarming that we're just turning people loose with very little background checks?
I find it very alarming that people are getting lost in the system waiting for years to get an asylum hearing. That doesn't work for anybody.
Speaking of lost in the system, we heard a few weeks ago that we had lost 85,000 unaccompanied minors. The federal government had shipped them to Google addresses in America, and now it sounds like, based on testimony, they're not all minors, and they're actually, some of them here are doing a great deal of harm. Mr. Scott, I want to ask you a question real quick. I heard prices people had on their heads for coming to this country just south of the border. Last time I heard it was about $6,000 or $7,000 coming out of Mexico. Further south, Triangle Nations, about $9,000 or $10,000. And then Syria was $20,000. Russians were paying $19,000, and Chinese nationals were paying $80,000. Where is that money going, you think, Mr. Scott?
It goes directly to fuel the cartels.
It fuels the cartel. And what happens if somebody doesn't have the money? Do they actually become indentured servants or slaves? Is that what happens?
So that is one of the many things that could happen. The prices vary depending on how much risk you're willing to take, how far out in the desert you'll go, so they vary. But the price also varies if you're willing to do other things. So if you're willing to guide, or you're willing to smuggle narcotics, or you're willing...
I heard that's interesting, Mr. Scott. I appreciate you mentioning that they actually, if you'll backpack that heroin or cocaine or fentanyl, your passage is somewhat considered paid if you're willing to be a drug mule rather than a slave. Is that correct?
That is how some people cross, yes.
Ms. Nobles, have you heard anything from the Biden administration concerning the loss of your daughter?
No, I haven't.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, with that, I'm going to yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Ms. Jackson-Lee seek recognition?
I'd like to ask unanimous consent that I can submit into the record article Biden administration to send 1,500 troops to the southern border for support, roles ahead of expected migrant, and also to have a statement that reflects that the numbers have gone down as it relates to those entering the United States at this time. Ask unanimous consent.
Without objection, and the chair recognizes Ms. Ross.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of the witnesses, and in particular to Mrs. Nobles for sharing your story. And please know that I join with my colleagues in wanting justice for her and for other people who have similarly lost their lives through senseless acts. And please know we're with you. Earlier this spring, and the ranking member may have brought this up in her opening comments, we traveled to McAllen and Brownsville, Texas, 2 Texas border towns. Our conversations with U.S. Custom and Border Protection during that visit reinforced my commitment to ensuring that CBP has the resources that it needs to strengthen border control. Agents we spoke with specifically emphasized the need for sophisticated surveillance technology to monitor border crossings. They talked about how the cartels had more drones and kids on roofs who were operating the drones than the kinds of technology that we needed to see people before they got to the border and be able to stem that. And I see that Chief Scott is nodding as I talked about that. During our visit, I was also struck by the reliance of our immigration and asylum systems on nonprofits and local governments, that they were not getting the support from the federal government or the state governments to do their jobs. And what goes on in Brownsville, Texas, on the local government tax dollars is nothing short of extraordinary to make sure that people who have been allowed to cross the border can get on their way quickly and not be in Brownsville and not be in those hotels. They say they don't want people to stay overnight in Brownsville. They want to get people to the bus station. They want to get people to the airport. Now, while their work is admirable, this responsibility shouldn't fall solely on NGOs and local governments. State and federal governments need to bolster the resources dedicated to responding to this many people who enter the United States under asylum claims and through other legal pathways. And the federal government must fund the technology that CBP needs and the training and the personnel so that they can do their jobs. Immigration is an extremely complex issue, and Democrats are pushing for implementation of effective solutions to strengthen border security and expand legal pathways to enter this country. It is important that we expand legal pathways because we simply need the workers. And I represent North Carolina. I hear from the agriculture industry every day. I went to visit a small family farm 2 weeks ago. Number one issue, immigration. Hospitality industry, number one issue, immigration. Tech industry, number one issue, immigration. We need to do both. In fact, we need to make sure that our rhetoric doesn't make the immigration problems worse. And unfortunately, it's been documented that repeated right-wing claims about the border being completely open are used on social media by smugglers to encourage more people to attempt to come to the United States without authorization. We need to have that stopped. We need to put aside our partisan blinders and use these hearings not to magnify the problems of our immigration system, but to solve them in a bipartisan way. With the remaining minute I have, my first question is for Mr. Hetfield. Unlike many countries, ours does not have a reception system for asylum seekers after they've been initially processed by immigration officials at the border and allowed to come into our country. NGOs and local governments like Brownsville, Texas, are stepping in to fill the gap that the federal and state governments have left. And we simply need a more orderly process. I wish everybody could see how well Brownsville does its job. From your experience, how are these programs contributing to a safe and orderly immigration system, and what more can be done in 14 seconds?
They're absolutely essential. When I directed the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom's study on expedited removal a few years ago, we did find that when you provide that kind of counseling, you actually have a very high dissolve rate by asylum seekers because they realize that they're actually not eligible for the benefit, so they withdraw their claims. But by not having a reception system, you're just contributing to having people get lost in the system.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Nails of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Nobles, thank you for your testimony today. I can't imagine. I have three daughters, 22, 17, and 10. I can't imagine what you and your family have been going through. And like so many other families across the United States, I'm incredibly sorry for your loss. Chief Rodney Scott, thank you for being here. I had the opportunity to review the case file. This is the case file on this murderer, well, I'm going to stop with that. on this alleged 17-year-old unaccompanied alien child who brutally killed and raped Kayla Hamilton. I know you're familiar, sir. You're familiar with the intake forms. Record of deportable, inadmissible aliens. This is the form here. So I'm going to walk through a few things that I noticed that I saw on this form. That this bad hombre said his intended location was Texas. And as we know, he then went to Maryland. He didn't stay in Texas, didn't stay there very long. This bad hombre said he had no funds in his possession and that his father was his method of support. And as we know, he somehow was moved to live with his aunt. This bad hombre said he was claiming credible fear. Credible fear like everybody up there. We know that a majority of those claims are unsubstantiated. I think it's about 10%. But later said on his HHS intake form that he had come to work. So he's a liar. He's a bad hombre and a lying one at that. The UAC said he had no prior criminal history. No prior criminal history. However, after his arrest, Maryland law enforcement, think about that. We can't count on the federal government down at the border to make sure that the people entering our country are decent people that don't have criminal records. But it took local and state law enforcement in Maryland. One phone call to El Salvador. That's it. Psst, get on the phone. I call El Salvador. I said, hey, let me ask you about this bad hombre that entered our country. Has he been arrested? And they say, oh, yes. Oh, yes, sir. He's been arrested in El Salvador in 2020 for his illicit association with MS-13 gangs. Couldn't figure that out down at the border. We got to find out after he kills and rapes and murders a young woman in the United States. He said he was 16. He wasn't 16. Had no form. You need to prove your age. You just say, I'm 16. We were in a case here a couple months or so ago about the gentleman that comes through. He claims he was UAC. He goes to Florida with his caretaker and butchers the guy in Florida. I saw a picture of this guy. He had more chin whiskers than the witness next to you. He's 25 years old. He came in as an unaccompanied alien child. How does that work? How does that happen? Why don't we have more safety guards, safety rails down at our southern border? So we were able to establish this man, or Chief, any of the 380,000 UACs that have entered since Joe Biden took office were under the age of 18. How are we able to determine whether they're actually truly under 18?
We really can't, sir. That's where a seasoned professional agent comes in. When they interview them, a lot of those inconsistencies you talked about come up in the story immediately. But the chaos that we have on the border today prevents the agents from having that amount of time. Yeah. The administration is yelling at them to process and move them down the assembly line as fast as possible.
So when the Secretary Mayorkas gets on front of the camera and lies to the American people every other day, if not daily, and he says these people are vetted, is that a true statement, sir?
They're vetted against a blank sheet of paper. There's no global database to vet them off of.
Yeah. And what kind of a border check, what kind of a background check is done on these individuals?
They're ran through a United States government, well, NCIC, which runs through criminal databases. But unless the individual's have been in the United States, committed a crime here before, it's not going to be in that system.
Yeah. You know, I've said it before. I'll say it again. This is number 3, I think, third hearing on the border. All Joe Biden had to do when he was inaugurated on January 21st, I went there, I respect the office of the president. All he had to do was keep his mouth shut. He didn't have to say anything about our southern border, and we'd be a much more safe country today. March 12th, 2021, I have a report, hold it up, following a reassessment, the DCD director terminated Title 42 with respect to unaccompanied alien children. If I'm understanding this correctly, is it true that for the last 2 years we created a blanket waiver to allow anyone claiming to be under 18 into the United States, despite their criminal records or gang affiliation? Yes or no?
I believe that gang affiliation, if they know, they could still deport them, but for the most part,
Parents,
yes.
Let's be clear. MS-13 stands for kill, rape, control, and Joe Biden and Secretary Mayorkas are allowing potentially 30-year-old gang members into our communities, into our schools, and around our kids, where they will do the exact damn thing they did to Kayla Hamilton. Shame on them, and we must hold them accountable. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Washington seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that the following be made a part of the record. This is an email that was sent yesterday by the Department of Health and Human Services reminding my colleagues that HHS allowed committee staff an in-camera review of the individual, the unaccompanied minor's file, with the expectation that the committee would refrain from disclosing any non-public information it obtained. It is imperative that we do not interfere with the integrity of criminal proceedings. I would hope that my colleagues would not disclose any information that could impact the criminal proceedings or Ms. Noble's ability to get justice for her daughter. It was a serious violation.
Without objection, that will be entered into the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'll next recognize myself for 5 minutes. Supervisor Kinney, again, 3.6 million illegal immigrants entering this country over the past 28 months. Gallup, by the way, told us last year they're estimating in Latin America and Caribbean alone, 42 million people intend to come here now that the borders are open. What's this doing to the situation in your homeless shelters, in your food pantries, and what are you hearing from other cities in New York?
Yeah, so as I've learned in recent weeks, we already have a lot of migrants finding their way to Rockland County through family and friends, and it's already putting a burden on our social services and our Rockland County, so much so that they recently had to give another $1 million to the food pantries. Keeping in mind that Mayor Adams got $1 billion from New York State, and he is looking to put them in hotels in our town without any support or any.
What are your constituents telling you?
The constituents have concerns, and as I sit here today and I hear this testimony, and I understand why. There was questions raised about where the individual was going to be vetted, and they were told us they would be vetted at the border. So in light of what I'm hearing today, it gives pause for the questions about who's going to be in our community.
Thank you. Chief Scott, one of our colleagues said that you had an impossible job. Was your job impossible when we were actually enforcing our immigration laws?
It was not impossible, and we were getting better at it every single day, and we had a strategy to actually secure the border.
But it's basically become impossible since Biden changed those policies. Is that correct?
Correct. The current flow of illegal immigration will exceed any ability to be able to secure.
When Mr. Biden canceled work on the border wall, did that not also cancel work on the technology at the border to detect illegal crossings?
It did that, and it also shut off our new communications capability that was being built into the wall system as well.
Under the Immigration and Naturalization Act, foreign nationals claiming asylum are required to be detained until their claim is heard. Are they?
No.
What can you tell us about cartel and gang activity that's being introduced into our country over the past 2 years?
So everything that crosses that southwest border now is controlled by the cartels. The cartels control the illegal migrant crossings so that they can create these gaps in border security. And then they smuggle, when I say gaps in border security, I mean they overwhelm all the law enforcement in the area beyond Border Patrol. And then that opens gaps where there's no law enforcement, and they bring anything they want into the country behind that. Even on the U.S. side, if it's narcotics or even aliens, they are basically facilitated or guided to their ultimate destinations through cartel on this side, and very, very, very tight ties with many of the gangs, MS-13 and others. Can't really tell where the cartel ends and where they don't. It's more of a terminology. But this is a huge threat, and it's gotten significantly worse with the open border created.
So they're brought in by the cartels, to whom these migrants pay thousands of dollars, arrive at the border deeply indebted to those cartels, and then they're trafficked throughout the country, are they not?
They are, and I really...
And who's doing that trafficking?
Again, that's still cartel, and that's still gang affiliations.
Do we not also have a lot of non-governmental organizations that are assisting in distributing these migrants across the country?
So yes. So currently they're getting millions of dollars. The non-governmental organizations are getting millions of dollars through FEMA. But the people get to choose where they go. So it's not necessarily those non-governmental organizations that are telling them, go to New York and hook up with this smuggler.
Right.
They're just getting the free plane ticket, the free care, and the feeding, a place to rest for a
free,
while.
Nothing's free. Who's paying for those plane tickets?
You are. It's going through FEMA, and it's basically money being laundered and given to the NGOs to support this entire enterprise.
The Dems tell us this is just a hemispheric problem beyond our control. But when we had the Remain in Mexico policy and were completing the border wall and were enforcing court-ordered deportations, didn't illegal immigration slow to a trickle?
Dramatically, and I agree with the colleague to my right. When people knew what the parameters were and they knew they couldn't defraud the system and get released into the United States before a judge adjudicated their case, they stopped coming. That reduced flow allowed agents to be more effective.
Ms. Nobles, can you tell us what you thought when you found out that the suspect in Kayla's murder was found to be an MS-13 gang member and that it was confirmed by a simple phone call by the local police department to El Salvadorian authorities, and then discovered that federal authorities never bothered to make that call before releasing him into the country?
I was very angry about the whole thing.
And what would you have to say to the organizations and officials responsible for the illegal entry, literally, of millions into this country over the past couple of years?
It's unbelievable. Like, I'm really upset about how it was failed at the border and then allowed him to go with his aunt. And then it started right at the border, and then it just went downhill from there.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Mr. Hunt, or no, Mr. Jordan.
I thank the chairman. It seems to me, Chief Scott, the fundamental question that people are asking is why? Why is this happening now at this scale? It's certainly the question Ms. Nobles has about what happened to her daughter, Kayla. It's a question the supervisor, it's the question the American people have. Why is this happening at this scale? Is it because, well, let me, you give me an answer, Chief, what you think the why is.
The short answer is catch and release. As long as people know they're going to be released into the United States, that is the prize. They don't care about all the rest of the immigration process.
And until you change that fundamental incentive that now exists, you will not correct the problem, right?
Correct.
And this administration decided on day one. I think this is so important for everyone to fully understand. On day one, they decided they were going to stop building the wall, as you just talked about in your question in response to the chairman. They said, we'll stop building the wall. We're going to end Remain in Mexico, and we're going to release you once you get here. They made that decision on day one. And that says it all. So people come, they say, you know what, we won't have to wait in Mexico. There's not going to be a wall to get over, and when we get in, we're going to get released wherever we want to go. Who wouldn't come to the greatest country ever? Good people and a lot of bad people, right? And as a result, do you think that it seems to me this administration made an intentional decision to put in place policies that have led to everything we've been talking about this morning. Do you agree, Chief?
I agree with that. All the conversations I was part of focused on expediting the release of people into the United States. They were adamantly opposed to detention.
And when you bring in, as the chairman just talked about, 2 million who come here or encountered who were released, another 1.5 million that we know came, but we didn't actually get it. They snuck in somehow. They got in somehow. 3.5 million people. There are going to be some bad people in there.
Statistically, that is guaranteed.
Drug dealers, gang members, as Ms. Nobles knows about all too well, unfortunately, they're going to be there. And also terrorists. What's the number up to now? Like, we're close to like 100 people who've been on the terrorist watch list who've been counted on our border because of an intentional decision the Biden administration made on January 20th, 2021. Is that accurate, Chief?
I believe that is accurate.
What's the solution?
The solution is to put back in place procedures that make sure that somebody has due process, but they don't get the prize until a judge adjudicates the case. You have to catch and release, and you can do that through detention, or you can do that through something like the Remain in Mexico program.
We want to let good people come to this country, legitimate asylum seekers, we want to let them in. But you know what our legislation did? It did what you just described. It said when you come to this country, you will either have to wait in Mexico, or we will detain you while we evaluate your claim. And the Democrats say that's radical. That is common sense. And if we'd have kept that policy, Kayla may be alive today because we didn't, all kinds of bad things happen. That is what has to happen. Until the country understands that, the Democrats understand that, it is just so basic. You can't just let people come in the country. You have to evaluate their claim. And while you're doing it, they have to be detained or they have to remain in some other country before we let them come to the United States. That's the answer.
That is the answer, and it worked.
Worked before. It'll work again. We just have to have the will to put it back in place so that the bad things we see happening all over the country won't continue.
Correct.
That I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes Mr. Hunt.
First of all, I want to thank the witnesses for being here today to discuss this very important topic that's facing our nation. To you, ma'am, Ms. Nobles, I am so sorry for your loss. We failed you. I'm so sorry that you lost your daughter, and I can assure you that you sitting here today means that she lives through you, and we will do everything in our power to make sure that her voice will be heard for the future to stop this foolishness from happening again. Thank you for being here, ma'am. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
You might be wondering what this photo is behind me. This is a photo of a room in a plush New York City tent made specifically for migrants. There's Xboxes and flat screens everywhere, and every creature comfort that you could think of is in this tent. This tent is actually nicer than my room at West Point. I wish I had this stuff. My colleagues on the left often talk about the long, arduous journey to get to this country, and I ask you this. Why would illegal immigrants not make the journey to this country if this was going to be the end result? In this facility, they get free room and board, flat screens, 3 meals a day, free internet, and phones. This is the carrot that is bringing millions of illegal aliens to this country at a time when this country can least afford it. For the Democrats, migrants jump to the top of the list while Americans are consistently left behind. Mayor Eric Adams never thought the border crisis would make it to New York City, and now even he has to admit that the Biden open border policies have created a, quote, real-life humanitarian crisis. I say again, a real-life humanitarian crisis. Welcome to the party, sir. Let me show you a real-life humanitarian crisis in its America's cities due to Democrat policies, and America's cities have been crumbling long before President Biden opened the border. And now that every town that we know of, including New York City, is a border town, it's about to get worse. This is Philadelphia. These are not illegal immigrants. These are American cities currently living in abject poverty. And this situation is about to get worse. Greetings from Gary, Indiana. Or is that eastern Ukraine? It's hard to say, but I can guarantee you that if this were eastern Ukraine, the government would be printing as much money as possible to help them, but not our own American citizens. Not so good for the people of Gary, Indiana. And this is not the Dust Bowl or the Great Depression. This is yesterday. And our situation is about to get worse. It's been 3 months since a train derailment in East Palestine, and the people of East Palestine don't have the necessary resources to rebuild, and the community can't even drink clean water today. And like Philadelphia, Gary, Indiana, East Palestine, Ohio, it was a part of the forgotten America the Americans left behind as Democrats provide the American dream to illegal aliens and not to our fellow Americans. I've got news for you. It's going to continue to get worse. We have San Mateo, California, in California's 15th congressional district. If some of my colleagues would spend more time in their districts instead of inside the Beltway, they would see the destruction that their policies are causing their own districts and their own towns. And perhaps then they'd have a different position on the southern border. And it's about to get worse. But wait, there's more. This is Redwood City, California. Or is it Tent City, California? Does this look like a country that's thriving? Does this look like a country that's equipped to handle a massive influx of millions more into this country illegally? I think not. The situation is only going to get worse. This is the death of the American dream, and it starts with the carrot, as I discussed in the very beginning, and ends in abject poverty and despair for Americans. It ends in us losing control of our sovereign border. It ends with cartels running our sovereign border and killing our young people. It ends in fentanyl overdoses. It ends in crime. I'm a military guy by trade. I've never seen a derelict of duty like this in my entire life. This is insanity. And while we owe the American people an apology, we also owe them to do our damn jobs. Thank you so much for being here, and with that, I yield back. Thank you, ma'am. God bless you.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes Mr. Swalwell of California.
Thank you, Chair. I'm proud to represent the 14th Congressional District of California. I'll tell the colleague of mine who represents the 15th that he should probably come and defend his great district because our two districts are some of the most diverse, wealthiest, most educated places in America, and one of the biggest complaints I have from my constituents is it's too damn expensive to live there because there's too much demand on housing. And so we've got a housing crisis, we've got a congestion crisis because of traffic. It doesn't look like a place that nobody wants to live, but certainly with open hearts and open minds, we're doing everything we can to address immigration in our country. What I hear from my colleagues in this hearing is more chaos, an appetite not for solutions, but an appetite to pander to grievances. They don't want to solve the problem. That's not worth anything to them politically. They want to stoke fear. When the Border Patrol seizes fentanyl at the border, God bless them, thank them for doing that. They don't celebrate the Border Patrol. They try and use that to own the libs and clap back at Joe Biden. Where I come from, when cops do their job and catch the bad guys and take drugs off the street, we thank them. We don't use them as political tools because we don't have any ideas or solutions when it comes to immigration. When they say we are a country of open borders, that doesn't recognize the thousands of Border Patrol agents who work on the border, work hard every day, and are trying to make sure we can secure the border. But what it does is it invites people to believe that the borders are open, and it invites more immigration to our country. Again, they don't want to solve this problem. If they wanted to solve this problem, they would have brought to the floor the comprehensive immigration bill from 2014, where 68 Republican and Democratic senators voted to secure the border, to put 20,000+ more border agents on the border, to have a pathway for earned citizenship, to take care of the dreamers who came here by no fault of their own. Republicans and Democrats voted for that. They walked away from it. And so this is really just more border theater, not border solutions. Mr. Hetfield, thank you for being a serious participant in this process. And I would just like to ask you, if we had passed that comprehensive immigration bill, the bipartisan bill back in 2014, where the most conservative members of the Senate joined some of the most liberal members of the Senate, where would we be today as far as immigration in America?
There's no panacea, but we would be in a much, much better place. We would have a fighting chance to address this issue. I mean, Congress has not passed immigration reform about legal pathways since 1990. We barely had we didn't have the internet then, right? Most people didn't have computers then. This was a totally different world, and that legal pathways have been totally ignored for 33 years.
Talk to me about, a shortage of labor, and I see this in all sectors across my district. I see it in childcare. I see it in tourism. I see it in hospitality. I see it in construction. I've got 50+ wineries in my district. I see it with the wineries when harvest comes. What would an earned pathway or a skilled workforce pathway mean for addressing labor shortages that only lead to every one of my constituents having to pay more for the goods and services they consume?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Like, we need legal pathways so that people can take jobs that American citizens are not willing to take. And there has been no movement in that area in decades. And that people are not coming here to bring fentanyl and to kill people. They're coming here primarily to work and to seek protection. And we need a system that actually identifies the people that are coming here for legitimate purposes and to give them legal pathways to do that and to identify the bad actors. But we don't have that right now. Our system is totally out of control because we have not resourced it.
Great. Thank you. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. If there's no further business to come before the subcommittee, that will conclude our hearing. I'd like to thank our witnesses again for appearing before the committee today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials for the record. And without objection, the hearing is adjourned.